In this video, we're talking about the master regulators of the endocrine system, the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. To remind you where these are located, the hypothalamus is actually part of the brain, and the pituitary dangles off the bottom of the hypothalamus, just behind the optic chiasma. This shows you what the pituitary and hypothalamus actually look like in actual cadaver section. So this is a sagittal section of the brain through the skull. You can see, if you look over here, we've got the different structures highlighted. So the hypothalamus, that is corresponding to this part. The infundibulum is the little stalk that connects the pituitary to the hypothalamus. So that's the infundibulum, and that's the pituitary right there. This saddle, this little divot that the pituitary sits in, is the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. The pituitary itself is referred to as the hypophysis, and it's two glands in one. So you have the anterior lobe of the pituitary and you have the posterior lobe of the pituitary. The anterior lobe is called the adenohypophysis, and this is glandular tissue. So it's basically endocrine gland tissue. The main part of the adenohypophysis is the pars distalis, which is the main portion. The pars tuberalis is the portion of the anterior lobe that extends around the infundibulum, and there is a pars intermedia, which we'll see on the next slide, which is between the anterior and posterior. You can't really see it on this cartoon version. You can't really see it grossly on the pituitary, but you can see it under the microscope. So that's the adenohypophysis. The posterior lobe of the pituitary is called the neurohypophysis. And it's called the neurohypophysis because it's really neural tissue. The posterior lobe basically just stores hormones that are synthesized in the hypothalamus. So these hormones are synthesized up here, traffic down to the posterior lobe, and released from the posterior lobe. And the infundibulum is part of this. The infundibulum is where axons coming from the hypothalamus pass through to get to the posterior lobe. Now, looking at the pituitary gland under the microscope, you can see that the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary really look very different. This is under low magnification. This is this little square of the anterior pituitary magnified to high magnification. And same here, square of the posterior pituitary magnified to high magnification. You can tell that in the anterior pituitary, you're seeing individual little glandular cells. Whereas in the posterior pituitary, it looks much more fibrous, because you're seeing axons and axon terminals and nuclei of scattered glial cells. The glial cells in the posterior pituitary are referred to as pituocytes. The endocrine cells, the glandular cells in the anterior pituitary, there are a few different types. You have acidophils, basophils, and chromophobes. The pars intermedia, I mentioned that would be more visible under the microscope. That's this stretch along here between the anterior and posterior. The anterior and posterior pituitary differ in a number of ways. They look different, they're different types of tissue, they're also stimulated in different ways. So I want to talk about the anterior pituitary first, and then we'll talk a little bit about the posterior pituitary. So the anterior pituitary is connected to the hypothalamus through a system of blood vessels referred to as the hypophyseal portal system. Now, a portal system in general is a blood vessel network where you have one capillary bed feeding into a second capillary bed before passing into veins. So this is the hypophyseal portal system because remember the term for the pituitary gland is hypophysis. So it's the portal system of the hypophysis. And in this portal system, we have the primary capillary bed, the first capillary bed that's located up here at the base of the hypothalamus. And blood from that capillary bed circulates through the hypophyseal portal veins to the second capillary plexus. Plexus just means network, so when you see capillary plexus, just read capillary bed. So there's this close vascular connection between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. Hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus get picked up into the primary capillary bed, pass through the portal veins into the secondary capillary bed, and hypothalamic hormones can then leave the blood in the second capillary bed and trigger the pituitary cells. Once they're out of the blood, they can act on the glandular tissue in the pituitary. And hormones from the pituitary can get picked up into the secondary capillary bed and carried out into the bloodstream, circulating around the rest of the body. So you've got this really direct connection. Hormones from the hypothalamus go to the anterior pituitary first. The hypothalamus releases two types of hormones. It releases releasing hormones. Releasing hormones stimulate the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary. So these are all anterior pituitary hormones. The releasing hormones are thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH. You should recognize both the full name and the abbreviation. You also have corticotropin releasing hormone, CRH, and gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH. These have their names because they trigger the release of thyrotropin, thyroid stimulating hormone, corticotropin, adrenocorticotropic hormone, and the gonadotropins, FSH and LH, follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone, which act on the gonads. That's why these two hormones are called the gonadotropins. The hypothalamus also releases inhibitory hormones, and these are called inhibitory hormones because they inhibit the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary. So they have a negative effect on hormone levels. And growth hormone inhibiting hormone, GHIH, inhibits the release of growth hormone. Of course, it's right there in the name. And dopamine inhibits the release of prolactin. This is also known as PIH for prolactin inhibiting hormone, but that's what it was called when it was first identified. Further characterization led scientists to realize that PIH, prolactin inhibiting hormone, is actually dopamine. Okay, now let's talk about the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary has a neuronal connection to the hypothalamus. Neurons that have their cell body up in the hypothalamus, they actually extend axons down through the infundibulum and terminating in the posterior pituitary, right? So, the hormones that are released from the posterior pituitary, they're actually synthesized up in the hypothalamus, in the cell bodies of these neurons. And then the hormones pass down along the axon and are stored in the axon terminal. And when you have stimulus of these neurons up here, you get an action potential sent down along the axon that triggers the release of hormones from the axon terminal. And those hormones are then picked up by the capillary bed in the posterior pituitary and circulated throughout the body. The hormones produced by the posterior pituitary are oxytocin and ADH, antidiuretic hormone. Oxytocin is produced by cells up in the paraventricular nucleus, that particular part of the hypothalamus, and ADH is produced by neurons in the supraoptic nucleus. Then they're just trafficked down, stored in the axon terminals, and released when these neurons are triggered. So this is neural stimulation of hormone release. Because of this close relationship between the hypothalamus and the pituitary, the hypothalamus really has very tight control over the endocrine system. And this slide summarizes that control that the hypothalamus has. So the first is it acts directly through producing antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin, which can then be released from the posterior pituitary. It also secretes regulatory hormones that control the anterior pituitary, and through the anterior pituitary is huge control over the other endocrine organs. The hypothalamus also works closely with the sympathetic nervous system. So the hypothalamus can control the sympathetic nervous system, and this affects the endocrine system by controlling sympathetic stimulation of the adrenal medulla. Remember, I want you to know what the hormones do and what the clinical effects of the hormones are. So the posterior pituitary is a little bit more simple, so let's start with that. There are two hormones released by the posterior pituitary. And remember, the posterior pituitary does not make its hormones. These hormones are made in the hypothalamus and stored in the posterior pituitary. The hormones are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone is also known as vasopressin. Oxytocin has a number of roles. It's sometimes referred to as the trust hormone or the cuddle hormone. It has a role in sexual arousal and orgasm. It also has a role in childbirth and nourishment. So oxytocin is the signal for oxytocin stimulates uterine contractions during labor, and if a woman is induced in labor, they're given a synthetic form of oxytocin called Pitocin. Oxytocin is also involved in milk letdown, so it's important for nursing. And psychologists are very interested in oxytocin because there have been studies showing that if you raise the levels of oxytocin in a person, they become more trusting. So there have been tests where psychologists have given subjects a nasal spray of oxytocin and then had them play a game that evaluates their level of trust in strangers. And people are more trusting when given oxytocin before playing the game. Some of the triggers for stimulating oxytocin are not super well understood. It is thought that in the milk letdown reflex, that its stimulation of the nipple triggers that that sensation triggers the hypothalamic neurons to release oxytocin from the posterior pituitary. Antidiuretic hormone is an example of humoral control. Diuresis is the technical term for urine production. So antidiuretic hormone is a hormone that reduces your volume of urine production. It makes your urine more concentrated, reducing the volume. Antidiuretic hormone production is increased when your blood becomes too concentrated. There are receptors called osmoreceptors, osmo for osmosis, that can detect the level of solute concentration in the blood. When your blood gets too concentrated, these osmoreceptors ping and trigger the hypothalamic neurons to release antidiuretic hormone. The effect of ADH or vasopressin is that it tells your kidneys to reabsorb more water. Right? Interesting point is that antidiuretic hormone is inhibited by alcohol. So if you have ever had the experience of drinking some alcohol and having to spend the rest of the night in the bathroom, it's not your imagination. It's because you're not concentrating your urine very well because alcohol inhibits antidiuretic hormone. Hypersecretion isn't really seen, isn't really a problem. Hyposecretion, though, if you don't produce an antidiuretic hormone, you produce low levels, it leads to a condition called diabetes insipidus. Diabetes insipidus is not the same as diabetes mellitus. There are similar symptoms in that excess urination and excess thirst, but the mechanisms are completely different. Here you have excess urination, which dries you out and makes you thirsty because you're not producing enough antidiuretic hormone. With the anterior pituitary hormones, things get a little more complicated because there are so many of them. There are 6 hormones produced by the anterior pituitary and 1 hormone produced by the pars intermedia, that stretch of pituitary between the anterior and posterior. Many of the hormones produced by the anterior pituitary are what are called tropic hormones. These are hormones that regulate other endocrine glands. You have the thyroid stimulating hormone, which, as you might imagine, stimulates the thyroid. You have adrenocorticotropic hormone, which stimulates the adrenal cortex. That's where the adrenocortico comes in, adrenal cortex. And you have the gonadotropins, follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone, which act on the gonads. That's why they're called the gonadotropins. They act on the ovaries and the testes. The anterior pituitary also produces growth hormone and prolactin, which are not tropic hormones. And the pars intermedia, it's melanocyte stimulating hormone, MSH. Because TSH acts on the thyroid, the effects of hyposecretion and hypersecretion are the same as the effects of thyroid hormone dysregulation. So we'll talk about that when we talk about thyroid hormone. As far as regulation goes, it's released in response to thyrotropin releasing hormone. So TRH triggers release of TSH, which triggers the release of the thyroid hormones, And then the thyroid hormones feed back and inhibit both TRH and TSH. That's what that flat line means, the flat line means it's inhibitory. So there's a negative feedback loop here. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, stimulates the release of glucocorticoids from the adrenal cortex, particularly cortisol. Corticotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus triggers release of adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, which triggers the release of the glucocorticoids. And then these glucocorticoids, in a negative feedback loop, they inhibit ACTH. CRH is released by stressors such as fever, low blood sugar, other stressors on the body. It's part of your body's response to stress. Hyposecretion of ACTH is very rare, but hypersecretion leads to Cushing's disease. Cushing's disease is what you get when you have cortisol hypersecretion. So elevated levels of cortisol leads to Cushing's disease. If you have hypersecretion of ACTH, you have elevated levels of cortisol. But it could also be an effect directly on the adrenal gland, direct overproduction of cortisol itself. Cushing's disease, you see a lot of visible changes, which are basically summarized in this slide. Thinning hair, flushed face, acne, increased facial hair, odd fat depositions in the face above the clavicles, in the abdomen, hyperpigmentation, these kind of purple striations, and easy bruising, thinned out arms and legs. These can all be indicative of Cushing's disease. The last two tropic hormones produced by the anterior pituitary are follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. These two hormones have slightly different effects in men and women, but they are all geared towards reproduction. Both of the gonadotropins are stimulated by gonadotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. And they're inhibited by gonadal hormones. So one of the effects of FSH and LH is to stimulate production of estrogen and testosterone, the sex hormones. FSH stimulates production of estrogen in women, LH stimulates estrogen and progesterone in women, and LH stimulates testosterone in males. And these sex hormones, they both feed back and inhibit the gonadotropins and the gonadotropin-releasing hormone. This pathway is, in fact, part of how hormonal birth control pills work. By giving a consistent dose of estrogen, birth control pills suppress luteinizing hormone, and by suppressing luteinizing hormone, they prevent ovulation. Hypersecretion of FSH and LH don't really have any significant effects. Hyposecretion, as you might imagine, affects reproduction. If a patient has hyposecretion of FSH and LH or hyposecretion of GnRH, they won't sexually mature. They show no sexual maturation. Meaning that they don't develop the reproductive structures necessary for reproduction. The major targets of growth hormone are bone and skeletal muscle. So growth hormone contributes to increasing length of bone and increasing mass of skeletal muscle, as happens during development. If you have hypersecretion of growth hormone, you get differing effects depending on what age hypersecretion develops. If hypersecretion develops before the growth plates close, you develop gigantism, which you become very, very tall. This is the wrestler and actor Andre the Giant. If growth hormone hypersecretion develops after the growth plates have already fused, you can't grow any taller, but the bones in your face and hands and feet can still grow in width, and this leads to a condition called acromegaly. Growth hormone hyposecretion isn't really seen much anymore, because if a child, now that we know what causes it, if a child isn't matching up to where they should be on the growth charts, they can be tested for growth hormone production and supplemented if necessary. But in the past, before we really understood what growth hormone was, you would sometimes see cases of pituitary dwarfism. Pituitary dwarfism comes from an untreated congenital growth hormone deficiency, so from birth, not producing growth hormone. This is Tom Thumb, who, as an adult, was 25 inches tall, about 2 feet tall. If you develop growth hormone hyposecretion as an adult, so you've already reached your full height, you're not going to shrink, but you can lose muscle mass and bone density. So growth hormone is important for maintaining bone density and muscle mass, even in adults, even once you're past development. The regulatory pathways for growth hormone are a little bit more complex, so we'll talk about those in a minute. I want to discuss prolactin and melanocyte-stimulating hormone at the moment. Prolactin is active in females, stimulates milk production in females. It's stimulated by estrogen and inhibited by prolactin inhibiting hormone, dopamine. Hyposecretion of prolactin is really only a problem for nursing mothers. So if you aren't trying to nurse a baby, the levels of prolactin don't seem to matter. However, if you have hypersecretion, hypersecretion can lead to inappropriate lactation. It can also interfere with reproductive mechanisms. It can lead to infertility and impotence. Melanocyte-stimulating hormone from the pars intermedia is a bit of a mystery. It's believed to be non-functional in adult humans, although in other animals it does play an important role in pigmentation, as you might guess from the name. Melanocyte-stimulating hormone. It produces melanin-producing cells. It stimulates melanin-producing cells in other animals. In children, in human children, they do produce melanocyte-stimulating hormone, and it's produced during pregnancy in both fetus and the mother. That's why sometimes you'll see skin patches getting darker during pregnancy, and it's produced in some diseases. But the exact role, the exact function beyond what it might be doing to melanocytes during early development, that's not fully worked out. So we've talked about feedback control of specific hormones in the pituitary and hypothalamus. This slide just shows the general pattern that's followed by the tropic hormones in the anterior pituitary. TSH, ACTH, and FSH and LH, the gonadotropins, they are all stimulated by a releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. That triggers the release of the anterior pituitary hormones, which trigger release of a hormone from a second organ. And then that second hormone feeds back and inhibits the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamic hormones. So generally speaking, for these hormones, you have feedback loops so that you don't get too much. This is a very typical pattern of regulation. Growth hormone regulation is a little bit different. The hypothalamus produces both a releasing hormone and an inhibitory hormone. So when releasing hormone is produced, the anterior pituitary produces growth hormone, which acts on its various tissues through the somatomedins, are kind of an intermediary signaling molecule. And the somatomedins stimulate growth hormone, inhibitory hormone, to kind of help shut this whole thing down, and while simultaneously inhibiting growth hormone, releasing hormone. So the somatomedins act through both of these hypothalamic regulatory hormones. Prolactin, you have a prolactin releasing factor and inhibitory hormone, which, remember, we now know is dopamine. These two regulatory hormones, they act on the anterior lobe. PRF triggers release of prolactin, and then the prolactin itself feeds back and stimulates the inhibitory hormone and inhibits PRF. So it's, again, another negative feedback loop, only in this case it's the anterior pituitary hormone itself, the prolactin itself, that's feeding back. We've covered a lot of territory. You should be able to discuss the importance of the hypothalamus and the pituitary in regulating the endocrine system. You should be able to talk about where they're located, what they do, what hormones they produce, and what those hormones do, as well as how those hormones are regulated.